a few years ago now, they developed a new header that picks the sorghum up off the ground.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Comstock channel. I'm Arlen Bowling, and I want to encourage you to make sure you like these videos. Make sure you subscribe to the videos. Just click on that bell icon down below, and also make sure you share these videos with others. We appreciate all the help as you continue to help us expand our audience each and every day, and we sure do thank you for that. My guest today, Nate Blum. He's the CEO of an organization called Sorghum United. And Nate, it's good to have you with us here today. I appreciate that. I honestly was not all that familiar with Sorghum United, and I guess right off the top, maybe you can take a moment and explain what the organization is and how you got started. It's kind of a fascinating story.
Well, thank you, Marlon, and I appreciate everything that you do, and thank you for having me on as a guest. And I'm not surprised you didn't know what we are because we're fairly new. Our organization really is only about 18 months old. We started in January of 2023, and at that time, right prior to us starting, I was the director of the Nebraska Grain Sorghum Board. And when we saw that the International Year of Millets was coming up, about a year before that, even as the United Nations FAO was making those announcements, several of us from around the world that were peers came together and said, "Hey, you know what? Listen, let's find ways to cooperate and work together because we have the same problems wherever you go in the world in regard to trade and education for sorghum and millets." And so we started this group, Sorghum United, so we wouldn't have to fight over the same piece of pie, but we could make the pie bigger for everyone. And anyway, so myself and several of our European counterparts were found ourselves in Rome in December of 2022, which was when the opening ceremony for the International Year of Millets was. And as I looked around the room, I realized I was the only person there from North America. And there were only a handful of people from Europe, which were my counterparts already. And most of the folks were from India or East Africa. And, we just kind of realized that if somebody was going to really push and take advantage of this International Year of Millets and take the spotlight on this stage, it was going to have to be us outside of India and Africa. And so when I got home, unfortunately, we were in a financial position to be able to do this. When I got home, much to my wife's chagrin, I resigned from the sorghum board and we made this, what had been a loose organization, a full-blown NGO. We're in phase one right now of what we're doing, but we are growing, which is fantastic. Right now, we've got, in the last 18 years or 18 months, we've gone from maybe a few hundred stakeholders on every continent to now we're over 3,000. It's still kind of a loose membership. We're working on a few things that'll be in our phase two, including a new software platform that'll bring everybody together a little bit better. But we've got folks that represent all points in the value chain, not just your farmers and not just your processors. It's your seed dealers, seed companies, input providers, fabricators, again, those processors, investment bankers, and even consumers, people who are just interested in what sorghum and millets are and what role they can play in human health as well as environmental sustainability. So that's what we do. We really work in the food security space. We don't focus on large commodity trade. What we're really more interested in is value and regional food systems. So a lot of what we're talking about becomes food security, regional empowerment, value addition, direct contracting opportunities that can mitigate, the commodity marketing risk. And that's just as true here in the U.S. as it is, say, in Kenya. Right. So I think it's really important work, and we do it within the lens of sorghum and millets. We're very careful always to tell people that, we don't promote these grains over other grains. Corn's great. Rice is great. Wheat's fine. We love all these things. But there's room on the plate for everybody. And we focus on these grains because of their, again, drought tolerance in places that shouldn't be growing corn. And I've been to these places that are now dependent on food aid. But these grains also just they don't have the promotion that they need to have, and so that's why we really focus on these. So it's not a this or that; it's a this and that.
Yeah, so you seem to have a highly educational bent, I guess, on the mission that you do to help everyone understand the benefits that I call it Milo. Uh, Everybody else calls it grain sorghum the way it seems, but for those of us that came from the plains, we always refer to it as Milo. But it does have a lot of nutritional benefits too. And I'm sure people overseas are eager to hear about that.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you say the Milo piece because this is actually the first problem that brought myself and our peers together. Because when I go on a trade mission, everywhere I go in the world, it's called something else. So if I go and I say sorghum, say in Kansas, and they say no, that's Milo, or if I go to India, that's jowar, or I go to Ethiopia, it's mashila, or Europe, it's sorgo. And so, actually, the very first thing that we did was we came together and developed. We wanted to find a way to show people that these grains were all the same thing. So we developed these cartoon characters. Why cartoons? Because they're, I think, the most commonly accessible for consumers to understand is the cartoon format, right? So we developed these cartoon characters, bright colors, but also educational facts and things like this. And we named one character Milo. He's kind of a younger, like a kid character. There's a character named Jowar, and he represents the industrial applications for sorghum. Milo represents the environmental and biodiversity benefits for sorghum, and then Mashila, she represents the health and nutrition for sorghum. So what brought us actually to the United Nations FAO for the opening ceremony was that we had developed a series of 10 posters, and they were on display in Rome at the FAO for the international year. And those are actually still available on our website for free for download, and they're intended to go in classrooms. So they talk about those health benefits. They talk about those soil health, biodiversity, water conservation. They talk about all the industrial products that can be made with sorghum, like plastics and blow-in insulation, et cetera, et cetera. So I highly encourage if you have any folks that are watching that are in the educational space, these are great resources that can be put in the classroom, and they're free for them. Now, we've taken those a step further, and we have published a series of children's books. The first three are published. They're available on Amazon. They're available on our website, also, which is sorghosquad.com. And that's our primary funding source, but it's also how we reach out to consumers, because we know that consumers, whether they're in the US or Europe or anywhere else, they can't request a product if they don't know it exists, right? And most people, just like you said, you didn't know about Sorghum United. Most people don't know what sorghum is, or millets. They say, what the heck is that? And so we published these comic book style books, and I describe them as Indiana Jones meets Captain Planet. But they're fun, but they're also educational, and it's really in the hope not only to generate revenues for what we're doing on the larger scale, but also to create higher value markets for our farmers at home and abroad. And so again, sorghosquad.com, or find them on Amazon. They are also linked on our main website, which is sorghumunited.com.
All right, so that's excellent to know. Thanks for providing the URL so we can locate you online and keep tabs on what kind of jobs the organization is doing. Now, before we started the interview, you shared a graphic with me. It was from USDA, and it shows the sorghum planted area in 2024, at least as of the date of publication, what they assumed it was going to be. And it's kind of fascinating because in that graphic, it shows kind of a sudden drop off in acreage in the southern plains, but it seems like it's picking up in the central and northern plains a little bit. Kind of a weird dynamic going on there. Wondered if you could address that a little bit.
Yeah, it's really interesting because in 2024, we see overall a decline of about 11% nationally in production of sorghum. Now, these are planted acres as reported by NASS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service, which is part of USDA. They do great work at NASS, by the way. I know several of those folks who work there, and I can't applaud them enough for the work they do. And there are a lot of countries, a lot of governments and departments of agriculture that wish they had something like NASS. I can tell you that from my travels. Anyway, so what's interesting is overall there's been a decline of about 11% in acres. But the area where we've seen the largest growth is actually Nebraska, where I live in near Lincoln here. And we grew by, I think, 17%, 17.6% in 2024. South Dakota also grew in this last year. A lot of the states declined. Now, that being said, we're still small fish as far as acres planted, 400,000 acres in Nebraska. But what I can tell you is that's higher than it has been in a while. In fact, when I took over as the Nebraska Sorghum Board director, our acres were very, very low. But within the course of 4 years, we grew them by 130% at that time. So I'm not surprised to see Nebraska continue to grow as our farmers, especially as we have these drier years, droughts, they're looking to alternative crops, and the genetics have gotten better for sorghum than a lot of farmers remember from 30 years ago. The yields are better. We now have herbicide-resistant sorghums on the market, and so things are better. But what we still need are those value-added markets. Uh, in the South, traditionally, Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, we see more acres there. Those states are all down this year, probably, as you mentioned before our conversation started, because of the cotton market doing so well right now. And also earlier this year, just before planting season, the Chinese made the largest purchases of sorghum larger than they've made in maybe 3 years. And that was when sorghum was at a rock bottom price, right? And this is what happens with China, by the way. We love when they're buying, but when they're not buying, it's devastating for the industry because they buy so much. But even when they are buying, because they buy so much, they can kind of dictate the price, which is exactly what happened. And I think, by the way, they did the same thing to corn at the same time they made those purchases. This was back in February of sorghum. The Chinese buy 93% of U.S. sorghum. That means that the most of our sorghum is grown. The different varieties are commingled, so you lose any real value in value addition and differentiation. They get mixed into a grain bin, thrown on a truck or a train, down to the port, thrown on a boat, sold for the cheapest possible price. And because they buy so much this is just the way it works. Now, this is also why we want more regional value addition. We think that grain, exports are great. We need commodity markets because, provides inexpensive food, and that's fine. So we don't want to get rid of it, but we want to supplement that model with local value addition. So if I'm a processor, why shouldn't I locate my processing proximate to the production of the grain? And also by doing that in a place like Nebraska, we're 2.5 days by truck from anywhere in the continental U.S. And so now I've decreased my supply lines on the front side and the back side, right? Manufacturing has figured it out. Nebraska has a ton of manufacturing. And why do we have it? Because we're in the middle of the country, right? They know it. So we need to do the same thing in agriculture. We have some, but we need more.
Well, some friends of mine actually started an operation a number of years ago, and they were producing food grade Milo or grain sorghum and turning it into flour, shipping it overseas. I thought that was an interesting way to add value to that particular market.
Spot on. That's exactly the kind of thing we like to see. In fact, there is a new mill coming online. I'm friends with this couple. They're from Kansas City, but he's originally from Beatrice. Uh, she's actually originally from McCool Junction, where I was born and raised, which is kind of funny. But they're starting a mill. They have farm ground there in the Beatrice area, and they're doing that. They want organic sorghum, and they're going to sell to like your restaurants and things, hospitals and things like that. That's the market they're going after. So that's exciting because we haven't had a mill in Nebraska in probably, I don't know, 15, 20 years. So that's a good start. Now, we do accept it near Aurora Co-op near Grand Island, accepts it for an IAMS pet food plant. Pet food is the fastest growing industry for grain sorghum in the U.S. And then Pennington Seeds, way out in Sidney, Nebraska. They use sorghum and millets in birdseed. And in fact, any of your viewers, if you've got a bird feeder in your backyard, look at the ingredients on the stuff you're buying because it's sorghum and millets. And it's so easy to grow that the stuff that falls out of the bird seed feeder, we've got one in our backyard right here, it'll grow. So we end up growing millets and sorghum in our own backyard, thanks to our messy birds.
Yeah, I'll attest to that. I've got a nice, about a 3 foot wide crop of it in my backyard here right now.
Here's what's fun though: your consumers, they can eat it, and they may not realize this. And there are tons of recipes. You can just Google it. We use it like rice or as a flour, as long as as long as it's an all-purpose blend and it has a little pinch of xanthan gum and a little potato starch mixed in, we use the flour just like we do wheat flour. There's no special secret, and it's gluten free, and it's if it matters to the consumer, which sometimes it does. I'm not going to argue whether it's right or wrong, but it's also non-GMO. And then the health benefits, I can send you another chart actually that I love to share because it shows the nutritional comparisons between I think maybe 10 different millets and sorghum, as well as corn, I think wheat and rice. And so, I mean, that's a no-brainer. And then when we look at now published research from around the world, I think there's well over 200 peer-reviewed published papers now that all kind of show the same thing, that sorghum helps to rebalance the human gut microbiome. It has anti-inflammatory benefits, cardiovascular benefits, anti carcinogenic benefits. And it's because it's low on the glycemic index, it's really good for weight management and diabetic management. So we're seeing all these things, and so when you stack those up with the also again the gluten-free, non-GMO, the opportunities for improved soil health that this brings in a rotation, the water conservation uses about a third of the water of corn. Some millets use like a tenth of the water, by the way. Then consumers really, once you tell them these things, they're like, okay, this is great. Where can I get it? And so, big part of my job is to just tell that story.
For many, many years, the town of Carlton, Nebraska, had what they call Milo Days, and they feature Milo pancakes, and they make molasses out of grain sorghum. So good stuff.
They do actually. In fact, they still do Milo days. I've when I was director of the sorghum board, I would go down there. I was down there, I think, 3 times. I was in the parade and did like some cooking demonstrations and thing. I mean, it was a fun time. If you're from small town Nebraska, which I am, you really appreciate a good small town celebration. The reason they do Milo days, by the way, is because they were the first elevator in the state to accept Milo. The irony now is that that's all corn and soybeans, and they don't grow any Milo there. So I don't know, but great folks really enjoy Carlton, and that's usually coordinated on a Husker football Saturday. So nice to go to the local pub and watch the game with the folks.
They used to make Milo cookies, I believe, if I recall correctly. Interesting stuff. Well, you were talking about China being the 800-pound gorilla for demand, a big customer. But other than China, who are the big buyers of Milo around the world?
So Mexico buys a fair amount. I think the United Sorghum Checkoff Program, which by the way, we're not affiliated with them. That's the national taxpayer funded organization. And they do a really good job with putting out great research. Their agronomist, Dr. Brent Bean, is world class. He's fantastic. And they do a good job soliciting commodity trades, those large boats going overseas. I know they just opened a new market in Greece, I think, for animal feed. Spain buys a fair amount, Morocco buys a fair amount, but really it's China is the most, and that's a real problem for a lot of reasons. I know there have been stories, and I've seen some of this, and I think the feds are actually cracking down on this, where a buyer in Mexico will buy the sorghum and then ship it over to China so they can get around tariffs and things like this. And also, I mean, I don't think it's any secret that we have a strained geopolitical relationship with China. And by the way, they buy so much worldwide and from Africa too, and they're stockpiling all these grains. And it makes you wonder, why would a country that is, trying to expand their influence by force in the South Pacific and the China Sea, why would they be stockpiling grains? And I think if we're not thinking about additional markets, additional trading partners, and more value addition in local regional food systems, we may find ourselves in a very untenable position, should things escalate. And that's something I think we need, not just sorghum and millets, in all of agriculture, we need to be thinking about this. I mean, we can't just ignore it because they are buying. We saw this actually. This same thing happened when we had the trade dispute a few years ago under the Trump administration. The very first salvo in that was that China brought an anti-dumping case to the World Trade Organization on U.S. sorghum, and they completely stopped buying it. Price tanked, lowest than they I think maybe ever been. Now, eventually the WTO dismissed the case because it wasn't, it wasn't real. But that was the opening salvo in that. So, I mean, we've already seen this in sorghum. And I don't know why, as an industry, we didn't at that time, because I mean, to me, it woke me up. And I don't know why, as a larger industry, we haven't said, hey, we can't let that happen again. And so my job, again, I work all over the world. But I also work for my farmers here because I live here and I'm from here and I'm a farm kid. And I don't think the 2% of the population that is responsible for providing food for 98% of the population on the planet should be amongst the poorest people on the planet. So we need more value.
Do you think the crop this year is off to a decent start? Planting conditions, are they okay?
Yeah, sorry, I got a little off, didn't I? Yeah, I think planting conditions are very good, at least in Nebraska where I live. We've had a lot of rain. It's still pretty dry in southwest Nebraska where we typically see most of our sorghum grown. But it really has been pretty mild spring. Sorghum does like a little heat, and so yesterday we hit 90 degrees for the first time since last October. So I think it's going to be actually a good year for as far as yields go, because it's not as dry as it was a few years ago. We had terrible drought. Sorghum was getting maybe 50 bushels if they were lucky. But I don't think that's going to be the case this year. I think our sorghum is going to be very, very good here.
Seems like the big challenge for grain sorghum is just to get it out of the ground. It doesn't have a lot of strength like corn trying to come through the ground. And maybe an early freeze might be a threat, but other than that, it's fairly easy to grow.
But I want people to know this because you mentioned getting it out of the ground. The big thing that we struggle with, especially in places like Nebraska where it's really windy, is those sorghum plants that fall down, right? But what's cool, and these people are friends of ours. They're out of Giltner, Nebraska, third generation fabricators called Bish Enterprise, BISH Enterprises. But a few years ago now, they developed a new header that picks the sorghum up off the ground. So instead of having those losses, because of the wind, you can actually still do that and keep stubble in your field. So I highly encourage people, if it's something that they're really wanting to look at, I think that's a very valuable tool. And I've seen this thing in action. It's really good.
Interesting. That always was a challenge, I remember, depending on the year. So, yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. Well, thanks for joining us here and sharing a little time, and best of luck on your travels coming up. I know you've got a lot of world traveling to do here in the months ahead, so stay safe. Hopefully we can get an update from you in the future here again. That's Nate Blum. He is with Sorghum United. He is based out of Lincoln, Nebraska. And that's going to do it for this episode. We sure do thank you for joining us. For producer Brianne Hendrickson, I'm Marlon Bowling. We'll catch you next time right here on the Comstock channel. Thanks for joining us on our Comstock YouTube channel. Don't forget you can also find us on Facebook and TikTok as well. Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and or options is substantial, and each investor and or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.